Amen. So you're there in Ezekiel chapter 8. And in chapter 7, we saw the day of the Lord and really getting into the fact of God punishing Jerusalem. Now, in the timeline, Jerusalem has not been destroyed yet. A lot of this is prophesying about what's going to happen and really getting into why it's happening. And in chapter 8 here, it's also showing, actually, Ezekiel's going to see a vision and really see into what the leadership, specifically in the temple of God, what they are doing, and really kind of seeing, why God is judging them and kind of the extent of the abominations that are going on. The first thing that I want you to see here in verse 1 is it gives a timestamp as far as when this takes place. So look at verse 1 there. It says, "And it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I sat in mine house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, that the hand of the Lord God fell there upon me." And so we see here that it's in the 6th year. Now, go back to chapter 1 there, and what I believe is we are 1 year and 2 months past from where we were at in chapter 1. And so Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 1. And I believe this Ezekiel 1 here is telling us, I believe, the age of Ezekiel, but also the time in which he was that age and where we're at in the timeline of events. But we're going to see that the calendar, or when we're taking this, because it says in the 5th year of what? That's the question you'd ask. Like, it's obviously not the 5th year of all history. It's basically taken from a certain point, and this is the 5th year of their captivity. And so when it goes into the 6th year, they're in the 6th year of their captivity. And so in chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Kibar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God." Now, what I believe this is saying is that he's 30 years old, like in his 30th year kind of thing, but that it's the 5th day. It's the 5th day of the 4th month. So basically, he's 30 years old. It's in the 5th day of the 4th month. But then it goes on to say in verse 2 here, "In the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity." Okay, so King Jehoiakim is taken into captive. We know from Jeremiah that he's eventually going to be lifted up from his captivity after 37 years, but we're 5 years in, so he's still in prison and all of that. But we are 5 years into the captivity when we start the book of Ezekiel, and notice that it's the 5th day of the 4th month, and in chapter 8, we're in the 6th year of the 6th month. Okay, so obviously 5th year to 6th year, 1 year, but we're in the 6th month and not the 4th month, so we're 2 months past the year. But I believe to the day. So if you think about it, like that's to the 5th day of the 6th month or the 5th day of the 4th month there. Now, what's interesting about this, I always just like to look at the numbers of things and see where we're at and where we're at in the timeline and stuff. And if you know, when we were reading through Ezekiel, I like to look at the timestamps. So where are we at? What timestamp are we in? And you'll see that it's like the 5th year, then it's the 6th year, then it's going to be the 7th year, then it's going to be the 9th year, and all the way to, then it's going to be like the 11th year. And then it kind of, when you go through Ezekiel, there's going to be this portion of Ezekiel that's more kind of like, I don't want to say an appendix, but it's more so talking about visions he has for other nations. So you're kind of coming out of the timeline of dealing with Jerusalem and Judah to talking about Egypt and all these other places. But then you're going to get to where chapter 40 through 48, we're in the 25th year. Okay, so it kind of jumps ahead to where we're in the 25th years, and we're 14 years after the destruction of Jerusalem when you have those last 9 chapters there. Okay, so, but when we're reading from where we're at now, so from chapter 1 to chapter 8, we have some times that are given. We have, obviously, the one that's given at the beginning of the book here. But in chapter 3, it gives a timestamp as far as some days that take place. And So if you know, he's at the river Kibar, he sees the Lord, he sees the cherubims, all of that. And then in Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 15, after that, he basically is standing there astonished with the people there for 7 days. Okay, so in verse 15 there it says, Ezekiel chapter 3 verse 15, it says, "Then I came to them of the captivity at Tel Abib, that dwelt by the river Kibar, and I sat where they sat, and remained there astonished among them 7 days. And it came to pass, at the end of 7 days, that the word of the Lord came unto me, saying," and then the Lord's going to appear to him in the plain. So you have the Lord appearing to him at the river, then at the plain, and 7 days take place after that. So, and then we have in Ezekiel chapter 4, go to Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 4, where he's lying on his side, or God's telling him to do this. Okay, so obviously when he's telling him to do this, he hasn't done it yet. But he's basically telling him, you're going to lie on your left side for 390 days and on your right side for 40 days. And notice what it says in verse 4 here. It says, "Lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, according to the number of the days, that thou shalt lie upon it. Thou shalt bear their iniquity, for I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity according to the number of the days, 390 days. So shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year." So I believe it's very clear that these are happening one after the other, because it's saying after this is being accomplished, then lie on your right side for 40 days. Okay, so you say, what are you getting at here? What are you talking about? Okay, so from chapter 1 to chapter 8 here, if you were to look at a 360-day calendar, which is what the Bible is usually using, like a lunar calendar, 360 days, that 1 year and 2 months would give you, 360 plus 60, right? So you have 420 days. So 420 days are taking place from chapter 1 to chapter 8 as far as where we're standing, okay? If you were to look at, let's say, all the, these days that are to be accomplished in the 7 days that took place between when he sees the Lord at the river Kibar, when he sees him in the plain, and let's just say from as soon as he sees that vision, he just starts lying on his side, okay? For sake of argument, okay? And he lies on his left side, lies on his right side. That would be 437 days. Okay, that's if everything was just done like consecutively with no breaks. And nowhere does it say that, listen, do this today and there's no break between anything. And the thing is that if that were the case, he would be like 23 days into lying on his right side for the sins of Judah, okay? Well, in chapter 8, I personally believe that he probably hasn't started to lie on his right side yet, and that there's probably days in between when he's preparing all this stuff to do this. Because remember, he has to make this tile, and he has to basically besiege this kind of city that he makes up, and he's got to get all his wheat and everything ready to go for his barley cakes that he's going to have to make. And I believe that there's probably some time that's taking place there. But one of the big reasons why I believe in chapter 8 he's not finished with what he was told to do in Ezekiel chapter 4 is kind of something really simple, but I think that this really shows us that this is probably after he got done lying on his side for Israel, and now he's about to do that for Judah. Look at verse 2. So Ezekiel chapter 8, and this is just my thought process here. I mean, one, I don't believe that even if you put all that time, that there's enough time between that timestamp for him to be done with what's being said in Ezekiel chapter 4. But it also makes sense that he's going to be showing him all these abominations and everything about Jerusalem and everything before he lies on his side for 40 days, right? So it actually kind of makes sense that he's showing him this stuff about Jerusalem, because the next chapters are going to be dealing with Jerusalem and all these sins and abominations that they're doing. That is kind of setting it up for that. But notice what it says in Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 2. It says, "Then I beheld, and lo, a likeness as the appearance of fire, from the appearance of his loins even up downward, fire from his loins even upward, as the appearance of brightness, as the color of amber." And so this is something you see in chapter 1, chapter 3, and in chapter 8 here, the same thing. That Ezekiel's seeing this over and over again, okay, as far as the glory of the Lord. In chapter 10, it's going to get into the cherubims and all of that again as well. But verse 3 here says, "And he put forth the form of an hand, and notice this, and took me by a lock of mine head." Now here's why I think it has to be, which makes sense even with the timeline, that he's not done with what he's doing in chapter 4, because after he's done in chapter 4, as far as his whole accomplishment, is he's to shave his head and his beard, right? Basically take a razor to your head or to your beard, and basically he's supposed to take all that hair and do this whole sign with that, right? But at this point, he's being taken by a lock of his head, which is like a lock of hair. And so it actually makes sense that that's not done yet, that it hasn't happened yet. So what could be very well going on is these 23 days, if you will, or maybe days between when he sees this vision in the plain, and even days in between when he's switching sides, because he's sitting, that it states that he's sitting in his house when this happens. And so notice what it says in verse 1 there. It says, "As I sat in mine house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, that the hand of the Lord fell there upon me." And so it doesn't say he's lying on his side, like while he's doing this, but he's sitting there. And so I believe this is kind of showing us that. And I think that the fact that he's being pulled up by the lock of his head shows you that he hasn't shaved his head yet. Okay. But it says here that in verse 3, it says, "And he put forth the form of an hand, and took me by a lock of mine head, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoketh to jealousy. And I beheld the glory of the Lord, as Israel was there, according to the vision that I saw in the plain." So he's being brought into these visions, and the thing that I just think about with this is what's said in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, which is this idea of, is he seeing this vision? Is he coming out of his, is this an out-of-body experience, or is this something that's like he's having this vision and he's in his body while this is happening? And I believe that's exactly what Paul is talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 1. I don't believe that this is, when Paul's talking about this, that he's saying like whether his body went up to heaven or whether he was out of the body going into heaven. I don't believe that's what he's saying. I believe basically what he's saying is these visions, like seeing this, he doesn't know if he was literally in the spirit taken up to heaven or if he was just in his body seeing this vision. I believe that's what's being stated here as far as, and so you can kind of see where Ezekiel's seeing these visions. It almost seems like he's physically being taken somewhere, but yet it's a spiritual thing that's happening here. So it's definitely something that's just intriguing as far as what's going on there. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 1, it says, "It is not expedient for me doubtless to glory. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I knew a man in Christ about 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell. God knoweth, such an one caught up to the third heaven. I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell. God knoweth, how that he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words, which it is not lawful for a man to utter." And so I just kind of think about this idea of like not knowing, like him not knowing whether this person saw heaven, kind of like in a spiritual manner as far as like just being in the body, but like seeing all of that, or whether he's literally taking out of the body, spiritually speaking, and seeing all of this, right? And it's kind of interesting because I don't believe we can know because Paul didn't know, right? He's even saying here, he's like, I don't know, God knows. But I don't believe that this man's body was taken into heaven because flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God, right? It's not like this bodily, his physical body went up into heaven. Okay, so I don't think Paul's like wondering, did his physical body go into heaven? I think it's more so the idea of seeing visions and revelations. Whether you're in the body or out of the body, it's kind of like you don't really know. And you could probably ask that same question about John when he's on the Isle of Patmos, when he was in the spirit. Was he out of his body? Was it like an out-of-body experience, or was he still in his body when he's seeing all of this and that type of thing? And you may say, who cares? But I just think it's interesting when you see these type of things, what's really going on there. Now, go to Ezekiel chapter 8. And what we're going to see in this chapter is that the Lord's going to show him a bunch of abominations that are being done throughout the temple, meaning that whether it's in the gates of the court or going towards the house of the Lord and all of this, and he's going to show him things that are going on. And so basically Ezekiel's kind of be the fly on the wall, or kind of like he's seeing all this stuff while it's happening, like what's going on. And it's like when you think about what leaders do in darkness, in the shadows, if you will. I think about when it comes to our government and just the things they do in the shadows and things they do in the dark. And on the outside, they would claim to be Christian, they would claim to be a good person and all these other things. But yet in the closet, or in the darkness, they're doing all this wickedness and all this stuff. Everything. Specifically, what we're going to be dealing with here in Ezekiel is idolatry and worshiping other gods. And you say, well, our America is found as a Christian nation. Yeah, except for the fact that you have like places like the Bohemian Grove, where you had presidents that went there and they would burn an effigy of a person to this owl statue. And and there's videos of this, So Alex Jones, he was right about the frogs, and so maybe, But, honestly, they don't even hide it anymore, that happens. They just say, oh, it's just to get rid of cares and all this other stuff. And here's the thing, when it comes to, worshiping other gods and being in idolatry, it's always kind of just, it's not that. It's not really that. I think about like the idolatry that's in the Catholic Church and the idea of, well, we're not really worshiping Mary, we're just venerating Mary. And it's like, well, okay, but bowing down on a knee and lighting a candle in front of an image of a woman that's supposed to be Mary and the baby Jesus and praying to it, you can call it what you want. That very much seems like worship to me. And you can name it whatever you want. And I'm sure all these cases, they'd be like, well, we're not really worshiping, the sun. We're not really worshiping this false god over here. And, but in the end, it doesn't really matter what you think you're doing when the act is just obvious. So, go to Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 3. Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 3. Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 3. So we're going to start, the Lord's going to take him to the north inner gate. And so they're going to see this seat of the image of jealousy. So we don't really know. It doesn't tell us what this is exactly. But I do believe that this is an image dealing with a false god or an idol of some sort. In verse 3 here, and throughout here, we're going to see things that are more specific. Some things are more generally stated, like the seed of the image of jealousy here. But it says in verse 3 here, it says, and he put forth the form of an hand, and took me by a lock of mine head, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north. where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoketh to jealousy. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, according to the vision that I saw in the plain. Then said he unto me, Son of man, lift up thine eyes now the way toward the north. So I lifted up mine eyes the way toward the north, and behold, northward at the gate of the altar, this image of jealousy in the entry. And he said furthermore unto me, Son of man, seest thou what they do, even the great abominations that the house of Israel committeth here, that I should go far off from my sanctuary? But turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations. That's kind of the theme that this chapter is getting into, is it'll show you something, and then he'll say, I'll show you greater abominations than this. And so we see this seed of jealousy here, this image of jealousy. And I want to show you that when you see this, you say, well, how do you know what this is? Well, the term jealousy is used a lot in the Old Testament. But I think, looking back at the law is a good place to go to, the first 5 books of Moses and dealing with what makes God jealous. And go to Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32. And I believe it's very clear that we're talking about idolatry. We're talking about, either graven images or images, just images in general. I don't believe idolatry is just limited to graven images either. When it comes to idolatry, we know that idolatry, could be just covetousness. But, just an image of a thing. It's kind of like, the Catholic Church that I used to go to. They obviously had a graven image of Mary. But they also had just a painting of her. And the painting is where they had the candles, where you would kneel down, and they had a little thing that would come down to where you kneel down, and it's padded and all that, because you don't want to hurt your little knees when you go to bow down to this image. But basically, you would light a candle and say a prayer in front of this image. But who would say that's not idolatry, right? As far as the idea of, just because it's a painting, it's like 2-dimensional, compared to being 3-dimensional or graven or whatever. Okay. And here's the thing: if something's a graven image, doesn't make it an idol, right? If you have a wooden doll, yeah, it's graven with a tool, but it's not an idol unless you're worshiping it, right? And so that's, when it comes to that second commandment, yeah, don't make a graven image that you bow down to it and worship it. But listen, I don't believe it's just to things that are graven that could be idols. Obviously images can be idols as far as just a painting or a picture or things like that, okay? But I also don't believe that all pictures and paintings are idols, okay? So obviously it depends on what you're doing with that and what it's portraying. And this isn't a whole sermon on idolatry or graven images, but Deuteronomy 32 and verse 15, and the thing is that we don't really see exactly what's being stated here, besides the fact that we're talking about an image of jealousy. So we're talking about an image, so that's clearly stated, and it's an image of jealousy. So I want you to see here in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 15, it says, But Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked, thou art waxen fat, thou art grown thick, thou art covered with fatness. Then he forsook God, which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. They provoked him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations provoked they him to anger. They sacrificed unto devils. Now we know from the New Testament that when it talks about eating things sacrificed unto idols, that's synonymous with things sacrificed unto devils, right? And so we see, and throughout the Bible it does this, but here it's very clear that when we're talking about strange gods and we're talking about, this, what's provoking him to jealousy is, they're sacrificing unto devils, not to God, to gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not. Of the rock that begat thee, thou art unmindful, and hast forgotten God that formed thee. And when the Lord saw it, he abhorred them because of the provoking of his sons and his daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be, for they are a very froward generation, children in whom is no faith. This is something that what's being stated here is that basically the Lord is leaving this temple, and the idea of the glory of the Lord leaving the temple because it's going to be destroyed, and that God is not with them in this, and that they are going to be punished. And in verse 21 here it says, they have moved me to jealousy with that which is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities. I will move them to jealousy with those which are not a people, and provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. This is brought up in the New Testament. So specifically, you can definitely point this to Jerusalem in the time of Christ when they reject Christ and they're going to be destroyed and all of that. It says, for a fire is kindled in mine anger, and shall burn unto the lowest hell, and shall consume the earth with her increase, and set on fire the foundations of the mountains. I will heap mischiefs upon them. And what I want you to see here is the similar language that's used here with the judgments that are being put on them in Ezekiel. Okay? It says, I will heap mischiefs upon them. I will spend mine arrows upon them. They shall be burnt with hunger, and devoured with burning heat, and with bitter destruction. I will also send the teeth of beasts upon them, and the poison of serpents of the dust. The sword without and terror within shall destroy both the young man and the virgin, and the suckling also with the man of gray hairs. And isn't that what we've been reading through the book of Ezekiel? Is that exact type of punishment? The evil beasts, the famine. Here it would say hunger, but it says the sword without and terror within. And isn't that what we see throughout? Is the idea that without Jerusalem, what do you have? The sword. Within, you have the famine, the pestilence, and all of that that's going on. Again, Deuteronomy is just obviously showing over and over again that this was known that this was going to happen. And it did happen. And the judgments happened just like God said they would happen. And so this seed of jealousy, this image of jealousy that he sees there, and verse 7 here, so going back to Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 7, I always just think this is a cool story where he's digging into this wall and he finds this door. It's kind of like this secret chamber that he's finding. So if you remember, the Lord says, greater abominations, you'll see greater abominations than these. And it's kind of interesting, too, if you think about in Leviticus, when it's talking about the punishments of God, the curses that are going to come upon Israel if they don't keep his commandments. And it's basically if they don't turn aside, for these, they'll be punished 7 more times for their sins. And it's kind of like this same kind of thing where it's like, you see this? I'm going to show you greater things that they're doing. You see this? I'm going to show you greater things that they're doing. You see this? Greater things that they're doing. So when the judgment comes down, you can see that kind of same thing that's going on. Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 7, it says, and he brought me to the door of the court. And when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. Then said he unto me, Son of man, dig now in the wall. And when I had digged in the wall, behold, a door. So he's going to the door of the court, but obviously there's a wall around that. And there's this hole that he sees. And he digs out this hole, and he finds another door. Okay? And it's kind of like this secret door, if you will, that he finds. And the Lord tells him to go in. And so this, can you imagine? It'd be crazy to think that God is showing you this vision anyway. But you find this door, and it's just like, just imagine what's going through your head. What am I about to see? Like, what in the world is going on in this secret chamber here in the court? It says, and behold, the wicked abominations that they do here. So I went in and saw, and behold, every form of creeping things and abominable beasts and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed upon the wall round about. So I kind of picture this as far as tapestries or paintings and everything else, that basically every type of abominable type of thing that's out there and idols and false gods, that type of thing, are just portrayed all over the walls in this chamber or wherever he's at. And so just imagine that these are the people that are supposed to be proclaiming that there's only one God and that we should be worshiping him and have no other gods before us, and we're not supposed to be making any graven images, We're not supposed to be bowing down or worshiping them. And then they find out that in the darkness here, they basically have all that all over their walls. So, notice what it says in verse 11. It says, "And there stood before them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel." And just so you know that this isn't just some kind of arbitrary thing, okay? You know, sometimes people take things, they're just like, well, 70 means this, and, you know, it's just kind of symbolic. Here's how I believe that this is just throwing that out the window, that this is just symbolic. That there were actually 70 men of the ancients, meaning you're dealing with the elders of Israel. You're not just dealing with just some peons or some people that shouldn't be there or shouldn't even be in power. We're talking about the people that should be the ones that are in charge of everything. But just so you know that this isn't just talking about some kind of arbitrary number, or just, you know, this vision is just kind of symbolic of what's going on, that I believe this is literally what is in there. Is because then it says, "In the midst of them stood Jaazaniah the son of Shaphan." That's pretty specific to just be, you know, kind of like, well, you know, this is kind of just symbolically telling you what's going on here. To just name somebody and his father, right? So sometimes, because one would ask the question, because if you look up Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan, you know what you don't see is him mentioned anywhere else. You see another Jaazaniah, the son of someone else. And I think it's in a different context, too, as far as what you're dealing with there. And so that being said, is that, one, I believe it's you know, not to throw other Jaazaniahs, you know, under the bus, to be like, hey, I'm talking about this specific Jaazaniah. But it's also, I believe, showing you like, hey, we're talking about real people here. These are real people that are doing these abominations, that Ezekiel isn't just seeing this kind of like symbolic type of vision, but this is actually going on. These are people that are actually alive, that are actually doing this. Yes, he's seeing a vision, but in the end, these are real things that are going on. These are real people. And I'm not even saying that there are people that believe that this is symbolic. All I'm saying is that details like that, just like the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, people try to say, well, that's just a parable, that's just some symbolic type of thing. We're talking about Lazarus and Abraham talking. Did Abraham speak or not? Or is that just some kind of just made-up story fairy tale of Abraham talking? Is Lazarus a real person or not? And so when you see things like that, it really kind of separates what's just kind of like a figurative story to get the point across, or whether it's a real event of real people that exist in real time. And so, again, I didn't look up any commentaries on this to know if anybody thinks this is what they think about it, honestly. So I'm not here to like fight for one side or the other. I'm just saying that I think these type of details really kind of ground it in the fact that, hey, we're talking about real people here. But and notice what it says here, Jaazaniah the son of Shaphan, with every man his censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. It says in verse 12, "Then said he unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in the chambers of his imagery? For they say, the Lord seeth us not, and the Lord hath forsaken the earth. He said also unto me, Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations that they do." It's interesting because this is something that's just repeated over and over again throughout the history of Israel. Because even in Malachi, even after, you know, the temple's rebuilt and all this stuff, they're still saying, where is the God of judgment? This idea of like, he doesn't see me. Basically, think about that. They're in this chamber where the door is hidden. Who's going to see what they're doing? But you know what it shows you is that God sees what they're doing. Go to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. And listen, to bring this home, God sees what you do when you're by yourself and no one's around. And really, I believe the character and the integrity of a man is measured by what he does when no one's looking. When no one sees what they're doing. And that counts your wife, that counts your kids. and wives that count your husband, so obviously the other way around there. What do you do when no one's looking? But know this is that God is always looking. Yeah. So this is a great reminder that there's no place for you to go to hide from God. They think that he doesn't see, but it's foolishness to think that. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11 here just makes me think of this idea of what people do in the darkness and everything. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11, it says, "And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. For it is a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret." It talks about water, it talks about waters and bread eaten in secret is sweet and it's pleasant. And this idea of sin and how it's pleasurable when you think you're basically isolated from everybody and you're doing it in the darkness and no one sees it. But the truth of the matter is that God sees it. Adultery's that way. Adultery, people commit adultery and they think that no one sees what's happening, but God sees it. And let me ask you a question. Who would you fear more out of everybody, of anything? It should be the Lord. But the truth of the matter is a lot of times we don't really believe that God sees us. It's not real to us that God sees us. Go to Jeremiah chapter 23. Jeremiah chapter 23. Jeremiah chapter 23. And I want you to think about the leaders of, that's the state of Jerusalem, right? They're already in captivity. They've already been taken captive, though Jerusalem has not been destroyed yet, though the temple has not been destroyed yet, but their mindset is still in idolatry. And they have still not turned from that and saw the error of their ways, and they're literally in their secret chambers with all their idolatry and imagery around them, and they're saying the Lord doesn't see us. That is the state of affairs when it comes to Israel and those that should be the spiritual leaders of the nation. I mean, this could be a whole sermon on dealing with spiritual leaders and what they do in the darkness and what you see on the outside. And the sad part about that is that because there's a lot of leaders that do that, where they are a different person in the dark than they are in the light, that people then don't trust anybody that's a leader. And they taint it for everybody. And then basically they just throw leadership out the window and just throw church out the window. And you see stuff like this, you can imagine Ezekiel's just like, what are we even doing? 70 of the elders of the ancients of Israel are standing there doing all this stuff. And then you're just thinking like, what in the world? There's not even just one person. I mean, you're dealing with a lot of people that are involved in this. So in Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 23, it says, am I a God at hand, saith the Lord, and not a God afar off? Can any hide himself in secret places that I shall not see him? Now, this is a rhetorical question, right? It says, saith the Lord, do not I fill heaven and earth, saith the Lord? It's like whether I ascend up in heaven, behold, thou art there. Whether I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. Right? You're not getting away from God. And there's nowhere you can go where he's not going to see you. And so it's foolishness, and it really just shows you how they're just kidding themselves in that idea of that, well, God doesn't see me, and, basically, the Lord hath forsaken the earth. Like God isn't here. Like he's forsaken the earth. He's not around us. Go to Isaiah chapter 29. Isaiah chapter 29. Now, Isaiah chapter 29 here is specifically brought up, this idea of a spirit of deep sleep being put on them, of like what happens to Israel in the time of Christ. And Romans chapter 11 really hits on this. But I want you to see in verse 15 here, because it is very interesting on how much the first destruction of Jerusalem mirrors the second destruction that happens in the time of Christ. You know, it just, history repeats itself, right? And a lot of the same stuff that's happening here in Ezekiel happens again. And so it's a foreshadowing, but at the same time, it's just relaying to you what they did. It's just that they do the same thing. It's interesting that they make a golden calf coming out of the land of Egypt, and then what does Jeroboam do? He makes a golden calf and says the exact same thing that they say in the wilderness and say, "Behold, thy gods that brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." And you're just like, what are you doing? So, but in verse 15 here, well, look at verse 14. It says, "Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid." Now, listen, if you're saying that God doesn't see you, I'd say that your wisdom is pretty much forsaken you, right? I wouldn't say that you're a very wise person at all if you're saying that, or that the Lord has forsaken the earth. But then it goes on to say in verse 15, it says, "Woe unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord." Their counsel. They're trying to basically hide what they want to do, what their plan is, right? They have this plan, and they think they're going to hide it from the Lord. And their works are in the dark, and they say, "Who seeth us, and who knoweth us?" Notice what it says in verse 16. "Surely your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as the potter's clay. For they shall, shall the work say of him that made it, he made me not? Or shall the thing framed say of him that framed it, he had no understanding?" It's basically giving you an illustration here. It's like, that's like the clay saying to the potter, "You don't know what I'm doing," right? You don't know what I'm doing. You don't know what I'm planning to do. It's just pure foolishness to think that way. Yet we live in a world where people literally think that way when it comes to the Lord. They think that God doesn't see them. And people that ought to know better. And so, and again, to whom much is given, much is required. I mean, the world in itself, the fool hath said in his heart there is no God. So you know what? All those people that don't believe in God or say they don't believe in God, or those that aren't saved, you know, they know God's out there. And deep down, they know it's foolish to think that he doesn't see them, or that there's no consequences, or that the Lord's not going to judge, or where is the God of judgment, all of that. But how much more, you know, as far as punishment in this life will be on those that are saved, those that are believers, those that are children of God, that would think that God doesn't see what they do in darkness. And so, yeah, this is obviously we're talking about the children of Israel and the abominations that they're doing. But listen, we need to take that to heart in our own lives, that, you know, if there's any type of sin that you're in your life that you think is in the darkness, yeah, well, maybe no one knows about that that's around you, but God knows about it. And so, go to Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 14. Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 14. So, we saw the seed of the image of jealousy that was at the gate. We saw the fact that he digs through this wall, finds this kind of secret chamber where there's over 70 men that are in this chamber where all this idolatry and imagery is around. And the they're bringing up incense in this place. So you say, well, you know, they just have these images. The fact that incense is being brought up in this chamber where all this imagery is at shows you that it's more than them just liking the picture. Okay, it's like, oh, that's a cool picture. It's like, oh, I just have this for historic value. It's like, nah, not when you're just like burning incense to it or whatever. And listen, I'm sure they probably paint that as being somehow like not idolatry and not, you know, what it is. It's like, don't believe your lying eyes here, Ezekiel. You know, this is really in honor of the Lord, you know. But Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 14, we see here the door of the gate of the Lord's house. It says, verse 14, it says, "Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz." I'm not sure if that's how you say that name, but who cares, right? So, Tammuz. It says, "Then said he unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations than these." So Tammuz, just looking this up and take it for what it is a Mesopotamian demigod of fertility. So it kind of makes sense that the women would be praying or would be weeping to this god, this false god. So here we see kind of more of a specific, right? Whereas where we saw like these images, and it was kind of telling us, it's some creeping things, abominable beasts, and different things like that, and then the idols. But we don't really know exactly what kind of gods they're dealing with there, right? And the first thing that's stated is just like this image of jealousy, right? So it's pretty vague as far as what we're dealing with there. We can assess that it's an idol. But as we get further, it gets a little more specific. Now we're dealing with, I believe, this, and this kind of goes back to Sumerian type of, it's kind of like the Greek gods and the Roman gods. They basically are the same, like Jupiter and Zeus are the same god, and going down the line. My kids could sing you the song. They know the song of the Greek and Roman gods and how they fit together there. So, and no, we're not, praying to the sun god or anything like that. It's like, what are you doing in the dark, Pastor? But it's kind of like Artemis and Diana. So like in Ephesus, they worship the great goddess Diana. Well, the Greek god is Artemis, and so they're just tit for tat or whatever. So, and Jupiter, when they're saying Jupiter, they're talking about Zeus. That's like obviously Greek is Zeus. Anyway, so you say, why do you need to know that? Well, I mean, the Bible does bring them up, so I mean, it's not a bad idea to at least know what they're talking about. Okay. Because if you were reading this passage right here, if you didn't know who Tammuz is, you can assess it's a false god, right? But I think it does give it make more sense that the women are the ones weeping after this, if you're dealing with fertility, right? So they're basically, wanting to get pregnant and all of that. But instead of going to the Lord, who openeth and closeth the womb, they're going to some false god. Go to Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 16. Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 16. Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 16 here. It says, "And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, so 25 men, and it says, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they worship the sun toward the east." So now we see, and I want you to think about all this together, right? At the north gate of the whole thing, they're dealing with, the temple. It has like the outer court, the inner court. It's got you have the sanctuary, and you have the holiest of all, and all of that. But Solomon's temple had a lot of chambers and for the priests and stuff like that too. And also the temple that the second temple had that type of stuff too. It's not just the tabernacle that you see in the wilderness. There was all these other structures that were kind of around it. So when it talks about he was teaching in the temple, like Jesus was teaching in the temple, he obviously wasn't in the sanctuary, where the candlestick was teaching people. So the temple, a lot of times, would be talking about kind of like the inner court and the outer court and all that too, okay? But they have, every word is important as far as what's being described here. if the temple's behind me, they have their backs to the temple and they're facing toward the sun god, which is obviously just kind of showing, spiritually speaking, what's going on. Is that if you're worshiping some other god, you're not worshiping the true God, right? And, you know, there's probably something to be said about how this is all talking about the north, the north, the north. And it's interesting because where does the destruction come from? The army from the north. So they're all looking to the north for their false gods to save them, and it's the north that the destruction's coming from. But also it talks about how promotion cometh from the Lord. It talks about from the east, the west, and the south, and then it talks about promotion cometh from the Lord. And anyway, there's probably a lot more to that as far as getting into the details there. But as you know, we're going through the book of Ezekiel. There's no way I'm going to uncover every stone of every detail when it comes to everything that's in here. When you're reading through the book of Ezekiel and we get through all of this, know this is that we're just scratching the surface. Really, think about this as like we're going through this, kind of seeing the main meaning of what is in Ezekiel and in these passages. And really, there's an infinite amount to learn in the whole Bible, but, in the book of Ezekiel for sure. It says here in Ezekiel 8:17, it says, "Then he said unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence, and have returned to provoke me to anger, and lo, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore will I also deal in fury. Mine eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity. And though they cry in mine ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them." I mean, think about how this is being set up for when the destruction comes. Of when you see the destruction, you're kind of like, I get it. Right, with all the violence that's going on, with all the abominations that are going on, that it's not just that they're messing up a little bit here. And if you read through the Old Testament, you know how long-suffering God is when it comes to the fact that he obviously was not punishing them harshly for not doing things perfectly. We're talking about some major problems here to where they're burning incense in this secret chamber to these false gods. You have these 25 men that have just had their back to the temple worshiping the sun. And then you have the women over here praying to some false god, or weeping to some false god. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17. Because the idea of worshiping the host of heaven is not new, meaning that obviously it was actually a commandment of not worshiping the sun or serving the sun or the moon or the stars or any of the planets. Which gets into, like, when you think about the Roman gods, a lot of them are planets, aren't they? Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, all of that. Deuteronomy 17, verse 2 here, it says, "If there be found among you within any of thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, man or woman, that hath wrought wickedness in the sight of the Lord thy God, in transgressing his covenant, and hath gone and served other gods, and worshipped them, either the sun or moon, or any of the host of heaven, which I have not commanded." So it's saying other gods specifically, the host of heaven. And it says, "And it be told thee, and thou hast heard of it, and inquire diligently, and behold, it be true, and the thing certain, that such abomination is wrought in Israel, that thou shalt bring forth that man or that woman which have committed that wicked thing unto thy gates, even that man or that woman shalt stone them with stones till they die." Isn't it interesting that when you see all this stuff, these abominations that are going on with all this idolatry, what do you see? The gate, the gate, the gate, the door, the gate. And in the commandment, specifically, and the last thing that's mentioned there is they're worshiping the sun, is that they should all die. They should all be put to death. Every single one of those people that are mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 8 should be put to death for what they did. That's the commandment. That's the covenant. And so when you see that God says, I will not spare, well, I mean, that's the commandment. You say, well, I didn't know that. Well, have you not read? That would be the case. And the last thing I want to show you is that, go to Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah chapter 7 is that Jeremiah is obviously a contemporary with Ezekiel, and he's preaching the same things. There's going to be places in Ezekiel that Jeremiah is just going to really show some light on that, where people will take passages in Ezekiel and just make up stuff that it's saying. Specifically Ezekiel 13. And the one that just kind of just sticks out to me, and I'll get to that, where they'll just make up stuff, and it'll talk about the fact of sewing pillows to all armholes and making people fly, and they're literally thinking they're flapping their wings in these pillows and flying, and they're talking about the rapture and that there's no rapture, and if you say there's a rapture, then you are a false prophet. And you're just like, what? But if you read Jeremiah and then you read Ezekiel, you're just like, there's no way you'd be coming to that conclusion if you actually knew what Jeremiah said over and over and over and over again, to not flee to the other nations or you're going to die. And that the word fly means to flee. Sorry, that's your commercial, that's your trailer into the Ezekiel 13 sermon. But stuff like that annoys me. And really, Jeremiah will clear a lot of that stuff up. If there's language that maybe you don't understand, go to Jeremiah, because he's preaching about the same thing. He's living at the same time, dealing with the same stuff. And so see if Jeremiah is talking about that, and it'll clear it up. But Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 13 here, or verse 30. And chapter 7 goes into chapter 8. And the last thing I'm going to show you here, but I believe is very much related to what Ezekiel is talking about and what God is showing Ezekiel. And so Jeremiah 7 verse 30 says, "For the children of Judah have done evil in my sight, saith the Lord. They have set their abominations in the house which is called by my name to pollute it." And you read that and you're kind of like, well, I wonder what they're doing in there. And then you read Ezekiel and you're like, oh, that's what they're doing. In verse 31 here it says, "And they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not, neither came into my heart. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be called Tophet, nor the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they shall bury in Tophet till there be no place. And the carcasses of those people shall be meat for the fowls of the heaven, and for the beasts of the earth, and none shall fray them away. Then will I cause to cease from the cities of Judah and from the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth, and the voice of gladness, and the voice of the bridegroom, and the voice of the bride, for the land shall be desolate." So it's foretelling about how it's going to be destroyed. We know that doesn't happen until 11 years into the captivity, but look at verse 1 there of the next chapter. It says, "At that time, said the Lord, they shall bring out the bones of the kings of Judah, and the bones of his princes, and the bones of the priests, and the bones of the prophets, and the bones of the inhabitants of Jerusalem out of their graves, and they shall spread them before the sun and the moon, and all the hosts of heaven, whom they have loved, whom they have served, and after whom they have walked, and whom they have sought, and whom they have worshipped. They shall not be gathered, nor be buried. They shall be for dung upon the face of the earth. And death shall be chosen rather than life by all the residue of them that remain of this evil family, which remain in all the places whither I have driven them, saith the Lord of hosts." So notice the judgment of God. And notice how it's the same stuff, that they're worshiping the sun and the moon and the host of heaven. Jeremiah is talking about that and talking about the judgment. They polluted the house of God, and we see Ezekiel is seeing these visions, and he's seeing all this stuff that's going on. Now, Jeremiah is in Jerusalem, so it's kind of easier for him to see that. And you can imagine why Ezekiel's having to go into a vision to see it, because he's in the captivity, right? He is at the river Kibar, he's in the plain, he's out with the captives, and he's not in Jerusalem. But he's still being shown those same things. And so Ezekiel 8 is definitely a very interesting chapter. But when I think about this chapter, I think about the idea of what people do in the dark. What they do in secret. And listen, it's easy to condemn the really wicked in the world that do wicked things in the dark. And listen, especially when you think about, praise the Lord, my news feed and like everything is, I must have done a really good job at like getting rid of people that would post, all this pride garbage this month. But you think about like that type of stuff that's in the world that people are trying to push and everything else, and praise the Lord, people are finally waking up. I think what I love to see is when this stupid pride stuff is being pushed out there. They're not gonna fly the flag, and I'm sure the news station's thinking like, oh, everybody's gonna be up in arms about this. Everybody's just like, yes, about time, like it's just normal people are just like, yes, we're done with this perverted garbage. So that type of stuff, all the homo stuff and all the stupid LGBT AARP garbage that's out there, that stuff, we don't even want to think about that, right? Because that, it's a shame to even speak of those things that are done in secret, and we don't want to think about what they do. We don't want to dwell on that type of thing. But listen, these type of passages, yes, I'm 100% would apply to people like that, but we need to look at ourselves and say, hey, what do I do in the darkness? What do I do in secret? And instead of doing wickedness in secret, what you should be doing is doing your alms in secret. Instead of having some vice in secret, some sinful vice in secret, maybe you should be praying in secret. See, it's not wrong to do things in secret, but the problem is that in the seclusion of darkness and secrecy, it a lot of times is what opens up for sin. But anytime when it comes to anything spiritually speaking, you don't just take away, you replace. You want to get rid of bad music and wicked music or things that are going to bring you down spiritually, well, you got to replace it with good stuff. What are you watching? Well, you don't just stop. It's like, well, I used to read these books and they were bad. It's like, well, if you like to read something good. Well, I used to watch these movies and they're really bad. It's like, well, watch something good. Not everything out there is just wicked to where you can't watch anything, you can't read anything, you can't do anything. Because when people do that, when you just cut it off cold turkey and you don't have anything to fill it with, then you're just going to go right back to what you're doing, because eventually you're just going to be like, I don't like just watching paint dry on the wall. And so when it comes to all these passages, and I know I've said this many times over, because sometimes when you get into studies like Ezekiel, you just kind of think, well, this is deep, and this doesn't really apply to me. This already happened. It's not a big, yeah, it's cool. It's good to know. But listen, these passages, when I think about this, I think about making sure I don't get in these dark chambers. That I don't basically barricade the door and hide the door to where no one can see what I'm doing. In the end, it should be more of like, I don't really care. It's kind of like, if I handed my phone to my wife right now, she could look through everything that's in my phone right now. And she won't, because it'll just be pictures of like structures and like really boring stuff. She'd be like, what? That's the typical guy, It's like, oh, where's the cute pictures of our family? It's like, why am I looking at this HVAC unit? Why am I looking at this serial number on the side of this thing, right? But that's not what I'm saying with that is that we need to have the lifestyle that says, hey, if you saw what I did in secret, you'll probably be bored, because you just be like, that's not that exciting, And so that is something we need to take to heart. And listen, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. If you think that I can't fall into that, if you think that I can't fall into these dark chambers and have all this wickedness and have all this stuff that can happen, you're kidding yourself, because every single one of us can fall into that. And the person that doesn't think they can fall into it are the ones that end up falling into it. The person that thinks they can't commit adultery and think that that's too far from them are the ones that could end up being the next person that falls into it. And so you should always be looking at it and be like, that could be me. Let that not be so. You know, kind of like as the Bible would say, God forbid that would be me, that would be us. Listen, when it comes to a church on, put it on a church level, with pastors that get into sin and fall into deep sin and dark chambers of their life. Well, listen, lest you get puffed up and think that you're so far above them, take heed to yourself. And look at that and say, hey, yeah, that's wicked, that's wrong, but I don't want to be that. And all these passages, when you see this type of stuff, we should always be looking at it and saying, hey, that's horrible, that's wicked. Let's not be that. Let's not be like these men that are here, that are putting their back to the temple of God to worship the host of heaven. And it may seem too high, it may seem kind of out there, but listen, it applies. And we need to take it to heart. Let's end with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the book of Ezekiel. And Lord, help us to apply it to our lives, and help us to understand it, and help us to understand all the details and all the hidden truths that are in these chapters. And Lord, just thank you for just loving us, and thank you for giving us salvation. And we just pray to be with us throughout the rest of this week and give us safety in our travels. And Lord, we love you. Pray also in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.